Thanks, Laura. I'm so glad you could join me today.
It's my pleasure. It's an honor to get to do this.
Laura, you're a Buckeye. You're an Ohio native. Tell me about your college experience and what drew you to accounting.
I went to Miami University in Ohio. It was my dad's pick for the strength of their business school. And at the time that I started my undergraduate work, I knew I wanted to go into business, but I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do, and knew that accounting would be a great foundation. So I actually started off as a triple major in accounting, finance, and Spanish.
Oh, wow. And your dad had been an auditor, right?
He was a partner at Ernst, started off on the audit side of things and moved to tax.
So your dad had given you some pretty practical advice in terms of choosing a career, hadn't he?
It was great advice. He said, you're responsible for your own happiness and finding your own way in life. You can do anything you want, except you're not allowed to try to ride professionally. For folks who know me, horses are my grand personal passion. I've been riding continuously since I was a child. And my dad was right. My horses are better enjoyed as an amateur. And so accounting, particularly having watched my dad grow up in public accounting, that felt like a natural fit to me in terms of a practical career that would suit me well.
And a way for you to afford your horses.
Indeed.
What kind of training and experience did you get in your really beginning jobs was Ernst and Young, is that right?
It was Ernst and Young at the time I joined the firm. Ernst and Ernst when my dad was there, and Ernst and Winnie. Ernst and Young by the time I joined.
Yeah.
And like a lot of folks early in my career, had a really broad base of clients and ultimately started to specialize in financial services. And most of my clients were banks and broker-dealers.
And you were aiming for the national office, right?
Well, I'd made a deal with myself. Having started in public accounting wasn't positive, at the outset, whether that would be the right career path for me. And my deal with myself was that I'd give it at least 5 years and make manager, and then make a decision about whether that was the right long-term career path for me. And I hit that milestone and really liked what I was doing. And so decided if I wanted a long-term career in public accounting, I ought to find myself a national office rotation. So that's what I set out to do.
And you got some pretty amazing experience at the national office, right? Will you talk about those experiences?
Sure. My banking background became the entree to the national financial services practice in New York. And originally the firm had wanted someone with more experience. I'd interviewed for it, and I think, as I recall, the person who was supposed to go backed out, and they called me and said, "You're younger than we wanted, but if you can be here in 3 weeks, you can have it." And that was the first relocation my husband and I did, so extra challenge to do it in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Spectacular experience indeed, as you start to really broaden your network, see even more of the corner case type things that are happening at the firm. And I didn't know it at the time, but started to become really great preparation for what I was going to want to do at the PCAOB. Started to consult nationally on matters involving FDICA, which was the FDIC Improvement Act, and that was the regulatory reaction to the S&L crisis. And big banks ended up needing to do substantially the same reporting on internal control as the Sarbanes-Oxley Act would later require of all public companies. So didn't know at the time, but it was really a giant field test of what was later to come. So I got a chance to see that both in the practice as a practicing auditor and how you would do that, and then handling the firm's national audit methodology on FDICA and dealing with all those national consultations.
You also got some IACPA experience, right?
I did, so I ended up with 2 separate national rotations. The first one in New York in National Financial Services, and then another one back in Cleveland in the National Audit Standards, National ABS practice. And yes, got to assist at the Auditing Standards Board and their work, which was a really interesting developmental experience for me to get to see more closely the interplay between the firm's methodology and the auditing standards, and how did the firm's methodologies differ? How did the auditing standards, in fact, accommodate slightly different approaches within a firm's more detailed audit methodology?
And then you were a working auditor when Enron hit. So what did that feel like? And Anderson, of course. Tell me what your reaction to that was.
It was shock, certainly, both at Enron and absolutely when Andersen went down. For me, I just had a strong sense, though. Although I was relatively young in my career, I felt fortunate to have gotten a good perspective on what was happening at the other firms as well, in terms of business development and acquiring new clients and being involved in successor auditor work paper reviews and seeing other auditors work that way, then the discussions and debates around the Auditing Standards Board. And I just had a strong sense that there wasn't anything uniquely inferior about Andersen, kind of there but for the grace could have gone any of the other big firms, and that it really was, it was a time to restore confidence in the audit profession as a whole and really improve the whole profession across the board.
And then tell me, what was your path to the PCAOB and why did you want to go work there?
Right. Well, I had this intense sense in terms of why did I want to go, of really public service and wanting to go help out. At the time, I mean, as everybody knows now, board composed of, the 5 board members, only 2 of whom can be CPAs. So what was going on in the press at the time was this hand-wringing. This was going to be the equivalent of lay people setting surgical standards. They're so going to make the profession worse, not better. And a strong sense from me of, well, it's literally going to take an act of Congress to make them go away. It's going to be better for all of us, not just the profession, but the capital markets as a whole. If they make things better, not worse, they're going to need good senior staff and advisors to help out. And I knew the internal control standard would be one of the very first things on the agenda, and I really wanted to be able to go help. And so I pursued 2 paths, actually. I was, a voracious reader and listener of all things the PCAOB was doing. And remember listening to a recording of one of the board's open meetings, and Kayla Gillen, one of the original board members, saying, hey, we're recruiting. If you have an interest, please apply on the website. So I did that, and it was form-driven, that went to a recruiting firm that was doing the screening. And it was a good thing that I pursued a second path, which was personal networking. At the time, Doug Carmichael was appointed the board's first chief auditor, managed through personal networking to get a personal introduction to Doug, and just approached him privately with, I really want to come help on the standard setting staff.
That's fantastic. On the first day, I think, that you started, did you get something in the mail that basically was a rejection?
Right, so that's, I can't remember if it was definitely after I'd gotten my offer and accepted. I can't remember if I would actually arrived to Washington or shortly before, but yes, got the form rejection letter from the recruiting firm that was doing the screening, saying, basically, thank you for applying, but you're not quite up to snuff.
Yes.
Which, in fairness to the firm, I think they were probably screening for different, more senior roles. But indeed, really good thing I'd pursued the other path.
Yes, really good thing. What was the culture of the PCAOB like in those early days?
Oh, intensely mission-driven. Everyone there had a lot of energy for the board's mission and felt a really heavy sense of responsibility to improve the profession, do the right thing for investors, and be really careful about the precedents we were setting.
And I understand that it was a very small staff and everyone had several projects. So what were your projects?
Well, off the bat, of course, the internal control was first up with the most urgency. Initially had great aspirations. We thought we would do more substantive standards much more quickly. The risk assessment standards were next up. I was originally supposed to be the staff lead on those. And it became very clear very quickly. It was going to be all internal control all the time, just about for me.
You have said that AS2 had a lot to shoulder, so explain that.
It really did. As I mentioned before, it was, I had an appreciation for the way the auditing standards accommodated different detailed approaches in terms of the firm's methodologies within each firm. And as the PCAOB, really got settled and matured with, the first time having standard setting, enforcement, inspections all under one roof, there needed to be some element of convergence, I think, more close convergence in the firm's methodologies. And talking about an integrated audit of internal control that touches all phases of the audit. And so that was one of the first things that I think AS2 needed to shoulder, was that some element of convergence in the firm's methodologies that was going to need to happen anyway. There was probably even more learning on everyone's part than I appreciated, particularly coming from my banking background, where auditing internal control already felt familiar. I think I underestimated the learning curve that would be really broad-based, how few folks had that background. It was, the first standard of real substance that the PCAOB was writing. So finding their voice, what that looked like. And I think there also was probably an element in terms of enhancing audit quality, where at least on some engagements, I think the audit engagement may have gotten more commoditized. And in terms of being able to enhance audit quality, at least on some engagements, firms probably needed to make up some margin. And the adoption of AS2 and internal control provided some cover for that, which was healthy and needed to happen anyway. But there's really a lot going on beyond just auditing internal control that AS2 ended up having to shoulder.
You've also said that it was the PCAOB, the first time they had the pen in their hand.
Right.
Can you describe what that was like?
Well, a lot of folks had expected initially that the PCAOB would delegate standard setting back to the AICPA, and it became very clear early days in terms of discharging their mission and protecting investors that they weren't going to be able to do that. I already anticipated that in terms of why I wanted to be there.
Yeah.
If they delegated standard setting, it wouldn't have had any near the appeal to me that it did, knowing that they'd be writing their own standards. And that was, there's an element of standard setting that is behavioral, right, in auditing standards. And so it was helping, and the board members at that time were as active as you would have wanted them to be in terms of what were their duties, and understanding what does it mean to have the pen, and being able to articulate things that both would make sense to non-auditors, but would also make sense, in fact, to, in a technical sort of sense, to directing audit behavior.
For the professional, that was a big change. It was like things were going on in a black box, right? Because they had been in the room before.
It was a really, I think, important change that you're highlighting. And the board certainly wasn't trying to create a black box or put the firms at any kind of disadvantage. I mean, that's the antithesis of what the board's about in terms of enhancing audit quality. But it was more a reaction to the integrity of the due process. And again, in terms of setting precedents and finding their way. The board, not a government agency, so it's not subject to the Sunshine Act, has some more flexibility in terms of how does it set up its rulemaking, but particularly at that time, and still today, set up with a lot of rigor. And so the intention was, in terms of protecting rigor, to create as good a draft, expose it for public comment, right? Everyone comment, take the comments on board, and then produce adopt a final standard. It really left out, it is a really rigorous due process, but yes, it left out a lot of the debate that would have been happening at the Auditing Standards Board of what does that really mean? How would different firms translate that into methodology? Is there a better way to articulate it? Even if there wasn't necessarily a better way to articulate it, the firms would have had some dialogue that there was a more common understanding of what was really intended. And so there was a lot of depth to that communication that then got simplified, just dimensions that were compressed.
Yeah. And you ended up writing AS2 in about 4 months. You proposed it in October 2003 and then waited for comment letters. So did you kind of expect that you would then be going on to your next assignment? And that was not, in fact, what happened, right?
Well, the comment period, there's a lot of time pressure because for large accelerated filers, the intention was everyone needed to adopt 404 in 2004. Folks couldn't do that without an auditing standard in place. So an enormous amount of time pressure to get through this rigorous due process fast. I can't recall now if the comment letter period on AS2 was 60 days or 90 days.
I think it was 90.
And the board, there was at least some light criticism on whether that was too short.
Okay.
But it really didn't leave a lot of time.
Right.
So there was behind the scenes, there was probably a standing advisory group meeting in there that I would have had agenda materials to prepare for and some other things. But really, the moment comment letters started to come in, we were already analyzing them and really starting to think about, again, in terms of the precedent setting, you know, how were we going to set up briefing papers and analysis, and the volume of comment letters that came was even greater than expected. And it would have fallen either right before or right after the holidays. But I do remember already having a slew of comment letters that I was reading over the holidays. I've tried to take the time off between Christmas and New Year's, but that year I was busily reading comment letters to be able to analyze them as fast as possible and then get together a really thorough briefing paper for the board. I remember reading every comment letter twice to be able to sort them in terms of, you know, major themes and comments, and then further analyze that in a really maybe loosely patterned after a pre-clear type process of, you know, what were the alternatives presented and pros and cons, considered and rejected, why. So it was I think a really thorough process in terms of analyzing the comment letters, notwithstanding being done in such a compressed period of time.
Then about 5 months later, the board adopts AS2 in March of 2004, but now it still needs to be approved by the SEC. So what's the reaction?
Well, fortunately, most folks' posture was assuming the SEC would approve it, and so they dug right into understanding it and going to work, as opposed to directing their efforts at seeing if the SEC would make changes to it. But the implementation questions came fast and furious very quickly, and that then became one of the initial challenges for the board in terms of another precedent to set. What was the best mechanism to be able to address the questions that were coming?
And you have said before, staff didn't necessarily realize that they would be getting so many, and many of the questions were surprising, weren't they?
They ran the gamut. Some of them were very surprising, and some, felt like very much an overreaction or something that wasn't intended and were easy to clarify. Others were maybe more interesting, if you will, in terms of more detailed fact patterns and understanding, so how would you apply the standard? But there were, in terms of precedent setting, became clear that we needed mechanisms to better understand the questions that were arising, and created 2 private working groups that I chaired, one composed of auditors and one composed of issuers. And we would have both separate and joint meetings. As you can imagine, the dialogues were different, whether you were meeting with auditors and issuers separately or jointly. And that dialogue became a lot of the basis. We had rigorous public speaking schedules. We had lots of folks coming to visit in private meetings. We felt pretty plugged in terms of the questions that were coming. But those 2 working groups were people who really invested a lot of time. They would come visit in Washington for full-day meetings to talk in depth about what the implementation questions were and give us a chance then to think about those and digest. The next precedent to figure out was how to best deal with those, and in terms of then really the fairness, in a sense, due process, decided that staff guidance was the best way to do that it wasn't something that needed to be addressed at the board level. These weren't highlighting things that we thought were surfacing anything that needed to be fixed, if you will, in the standard, that they were implementation questions that could fairly be addressed in staff level guidance. But at the same time, making that guidance available, publicly, so that everyone had equal access to it.
Equal access. And that was the first time that that had been done to staff Q&As.
There might have been inspection Q&As or something else, but it was the first time that staff Q&As had been done interpreting an auditing standard that the board had issued.
Yeah. And so now AS2 is up for its first year of implementation. The PCAOB ends up releasing staff guidance 3 times. And then the SEC has its first roundtable, and they're signaling that there's some interest in making changes. And so what was your reaction at that time, or the board's reaction to all of this?
At that point in time, I'm not sure that I took it as strong signaling for change, but rather just an extension of the due process, that it had been an enormous change and that it was an appropriate point, roughly a year after implementation, to solicit feedback and do a check-in.
Did you feel a lot of political pressure at that time?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, coming to Washington, I was terribly naive. I figured that out relatively quickly, because I thought coming to the PCAOB, as a nonprofit, not a government entity, that it would be this apolitical entity that would have a completely free hand, do whatever it thought was right for public accounting. I had no idea what a committee of jurisdiction was. I'd never dealt with government relations, and just completely underestimated, just the attention and politicization and polarization that would happen around the implementation of 404.
So then after this SEC roundtable, PCAOB issues Q&As in response to that. And what is kind of the reaction to those?
At this point, my feeling was still that the standard's not broken, that it's still a matter of implementation. And from my perspective, from my banking background and that experience, I had a good sense in terms of what I was visualizing should happen, and that this was very much a risk management exercise. This was about what could reasonably go wrong in a company's financial statements, and how do you know that didn't happen? And an audit of internal control is a rigorous process, but at the same time you're obtaining reasonable assurance, not absolute assurance. And so I had a strong sense of, if folks are having a bad experience with this, there's probably a misunderstanding somewhere, because at the heart of it, it should be about good risk management.
And did you see kind of this continuous flow of opposition? Was it renewed opposition, or it was just the opposition kept flowing?
Well, at a practitioner level, from the firms and certainly large issuers, at one point it felt like it was starting to settle down a bit in terms of folks understanding. It certainly wasn't a mature process yet, but it felt like it was starting to settle down a bit. But I think, about the time that it felt like it might be starting to settle down, then yes, it seemed like it fanned back up again. And it was hard for me personally anyway to interpret at that point if the way it was getting re-energized, if that was really representative of more broad-based issues, or if that was more a function of just the adeptness of certain voices to get a lot of attention.
Right. Then the PCAOB released their first 4010 report describing the inspection results after the first year of implementation of 404. And was that a milestone?
I think it was a big milestone. It was really important to the board in terms of realizing the PCAOB's potential of having standard setting, inspections, enforcement all under one roof, and being able to provide fast feedback to the firms on the application of AS2. And was important to take the approach, it certainly wasn't just friendly coaching, but at the same time it was strategic, that the regulatory response would be restrained and not put the firms under too much scrutiny immediately. But again, the feeling of time pressure to be able to get the firms good feedback, and good feedback meaning that the inspection staff wasn't just picking up the standard, reading it cold, and making some decisions, that we were closely collaborating behind the scenes and getting together in conference rooms and talking through, here's what we're seeing in work papers, is this looks like it is or isn't the kind of response that was intended, here's the sort of inspection finding that we're getting ready to tee up, you know, is that a fair criticism, how should we describe that? So there was a lot of collaboration behind the scenes.
But the criticism continues, and SEC and PCAOB announced that they're going to have a joint roundtable, and that's going to be May 10th, 2006. And did you have a sense then that changing the standard was kind of a foregone conclusion, kind of at this point?
I'm not sure completely foregone conclusion. You know, having the roundtable again was an important part of the public record and the due process. But I think it was close to it. I think there was a sense already and preparations that would likely be the outcome, that was likely what the public record would support coming out of the roundtable.
Was there even more political pressure coming from the Bush administration at this point? SEC sources have said that fixing 404 was one of President Bush's top priorities. So did you feel that?
I'm not sure about President Bush personally, but at this point it was the first time, yes, that the White House was involved in terms of getting earlier exposure to committees of jurisdiction and doing briefings for staff on House Financial Services and Senate Banking. Starting to undertake what became AS5 was the first time, at least at the PCAOB level, that there were White House briefings as well.
And then whose decision was it to replace instead of amend AS2?
Right. There was a lot of discussion behind the scenes about it at a technical level. There's a technical argument of what are you trying to signal in terms of the magnitude of change when you think about the way FASB undertakes their standard setting or the IACPA, and there's some threshold, right, of change that you're looking to drive, and that gets signaled by whether it's an amendment to an existing standard or a whole new standard. And there were, in terms of the magnitude of change that we were looking to drive, you know, that was an interesting thing to get grounded in as well. There were, it's signaling change. At the same time, there were parts of the audit of internal control that were being criticized unfairly. You know, an audit of internal control, you need to obtain reasonable assurance. It's not a byproduct of the audit of the financial statements. For the folks at this point who were taking a run at really trying to repeal the whole of 404, those voices were never going to be satisfied with any audit standard.
Right.
And so what became really clear and what ultimately carried the day was, look, that's really too subtle and too technical an argument. There's enough change that needs to be made, and an important rebranding in what is the audit of internal control. It really became very clear that the right thing to do was a new standard with a new number, a new title, and really completely new branding.
Were you overwhelmed at the idea of rewriting AS2?
Not at all. I was actually really glad I was still there. You know, coming in to the PCAOB, I mean, I never intended to be a career regulator. I intended it to be something developmental and short-term that I would help out. And so for me, I was really excited about if the board was going to undertake rulemaking to completely change the standard, that I was still going to be there, both to fix it, if you will, in terms of I know what was intended and why what should be a good risk management exercise ought to be reasonable and healthy. So both to have the opportunity to fix it and to keep anyone else from breaking it, if you will. So I actually felt really fortunate that I was still there to be able to work on that.
Why do people not understand that you actually wrote AS5?
Yeah, right. It's on the adopting release, you know, it lists the folks to call with questions, and I'm a pretty low ego, practical person. So folks asked me at the time that we were getting to the adopting release, it was already clear I was going to be leaving the board. And yeah, as a very practical person, it's in my mind not meant to be a roll of credits. I take it at its face, which it says who to call for questions, which I knew I wasn't going to be there to ask questions. So I said, don't put my name on it because I won't be here to answer questions. I had no idea what was coming,
right?
And this misimpression it would create that I wasn't involved with AS5 when I was very much. So I don't know if I had it to do over again, I probably would have said put my name on it, but don't put my direct dial line on it. Put the board's main number so that someone could be quickly redirected. But it's fine.
Yes. Why did you choose to leave the PCAOB at this time?
Well, I felt like I was getting to a logical point of closure in the work that I was doing. As I'd mentioned, I had never intended to become a career regulator, and at that point in time, I also was starting to feel like internal control was starting to define my career. I was so much the face of the board's internal control standards, and they'd gotten so much attention. And that in many ways I'm fortunate, but at the same time I didn't want internal control to define my career. And so that was part of why it all came together at the same time to feel like that was the right time for me to move on.
They set a precedent for you, didn't they, by sending out a press release?
It was really nice, yes. So yet another precedent. I was, I think, among the very first of the senior staff, the original senior staff to leave, which was really nice, particularly when I wanted to explore whether I wanted to go back to a firm or I wanted to go onto the industry side of things, which is what I ultimately chose. But that was going to involve recusals. And so not only was the press release a really nice public acknowledgement, it made the recusals easier, and it took a little while for folks to understand, though. It really, again, they should take it at its face. It was really meant to be open season. And initially, the reaction was a little slow. Folks thought maybe that was just a really nice gesture, but that I, in fact, had something lined up on the side. So things were initially kind of quiet, and my phone wasn't ringing until the word got out. No, that just meant open season.
Right. They sent out a press release that said she is going to leave the board, and so people could then be free to approach you. Part of your responsibilities at the board were to hire staff. So what were you looking for when you were hiring for the PCAOB?
Right. Well, it certainly wasn't just former national office folks. It really was much more about people who had a natural passion and energy for the board's mission and had good communication skills. There's certainly both oral and writing with a demanding public speaking schedule, and then standard setting. Much of what's done there is needing to be good at written communications, but really as much about attitude and aptitude, a willingness and interest to really become a standard setting technician. But again, not necessarily somebody right out of the national office.
And what were you looking for in your next move after the PCAOB?
Yeah, I ultimately decided to make a pivot, which surprised myself. And for me, there became really two big differentiators. One was about personal risk-taking and accountability, and wanting to be responsible for a big public company's financial reporting and held accountable for that, and not fundamentally an advisor. And the other was about people development and having the opportunity to lead a really large team of people, which, as you know, is just hard to do in a traditional sense based on firm structure.
Is internal control still a big part of your life?
It is. It's turned into a continuing passion project of mine. One of the things that had made me want to make that career pivot and get involved in public company controllership was time that I'd started spending while I was on the staff of the PCAOB with FEI's Committee on Corporate Reporting. So it's a national standing committee of FEI that's composed of about 45 chief accounting officers of really large public companies. So I've stayed involved with the CCR in one form or another ever since I've left the PCAOB. And so I'm a member now and have been chairing for the last few years an ad hoc working group on internal control issues. And last year we issued, for the first time, 2 in-depth documents on ICFR insights on the new leases and CECL standards. And just last week issued the 3rd document that is internal control insights on business combinations. So this is really the first time that this sort of in-depth internal control guidance has been published, or it's been written by preparers for preparers. A lot of folks have helped make those the, I think, successful documents that they are. So there have been a number of CCR member companies that have invested a lot in terms of the core team working on that, as well as the broader CCR. But also their auditors have provided input and feedback. The FEI staff has been a huge help, and we've had other stakeholders provide key input. So it's been really wonderful in terms of how supportive the whole really environment has been in trying to make those successful.
And did your experience at the PCAOB change you professionally?
Oh my gosh, yes. It's was even more formative than I expected. I do put spending time in Washington maybe somewhat on par with doing some kind of international experience, because it really is quite its own environment in terms of how politicized everything is and how does the government work. It is an amazing experience. Broadened my network so much, put me on this, a changed career path that I didn't expect. It was, taught me so much. Coming in, felt very well prepared to really add value and make a positive difference in terms of my background, and heading into standard setting at the same time had so much growing up to do. Matured so much while I was there. Really fortunate.
And I think you made a big difference while you were there, so I know they feel that way.
Thank you.
Thank you for this talk.
It's been really my pleasure.